Hello, I'm Ron Duncan Hart, and welcome to this segment on Jews and the Arab world, in which we'll be looking at the 20th century, 20th and 21st centuries, and how Jews and Arabs have interacted during this time period. Most of the Middle East was under European control, European colonialism. In 1922, Egypt received a partial independence. In 1952, it finally received full independence. In those 30 years, from 1922 to 1952, the modern Middle East began to take shape. Arab nationalism became an issue. And of course, we know 1948 was the creation of the State of Israel. So we'll be looking at these issues. How did the creation of the State of Israel, the rise of Arab nationalism, totally transformed the traditional ties between Arabs and Jews? Middle Eastern Jews had always lived in Jerusalem and in Israel. From the time of the invasion of the Arabs in the 630s, when the Arabs took over the Jewish population of then Israel. And over the centuries, the Arab population grew to outnumber the Jews in Israel. For centuries, Jews had lived throughout the Arab world. From the 1400s to 1920, that Arab world had been ruled by the Ottoman Turks, mostly. Before that, it had been the Abbasids. Now, we're going to find that with the new Arab nationalism, Jews were no longer welcome in the Arab countries. And we began a series of expulsions and pressure on Jews to leave the Arab world. Most of the Jews in this process, the Jewish families from Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, throughout these countries, Jewish families began leaving, and many of them going to live in Israel. One of the largest migrations was from Morocco. Morocco had 300,000 Jews. Now there are perhaps 3,000 Jews left in Morocco. As the massive migration, the pressure to leave the country on one hand, and on the other, the pull to migrate to Israel. So we'll look at this new relationship between Jews and Arabs that came into existence in the 20th century. At the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was disintegrating. And the winning powers in that war, especially the British and the French, got together in April of 1920 in San Remo in Italy in a large conference to decide how to structure the Middle East. And in that process, the various countries essentially carved up the Middle East between themselves to make colonies. The British held on to Egypt, which they had had a relationship with for some time, and they also received the British Mandate of Palestine, which to take the Palestinian territories, Jordan, and that basic area. When the results of the San Remo conference were announced, the reaction was dramatic. Led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Palestinian people reacted in attacking Jewish groups. In 1921, 1924, 1926 to 28, there were a series of attacks by Arabs on Jewish communities, leaving hundreds of dead on both sides. In the Hebron Massacre of 1929, Arabs killed all of the Jews that were living there, and for the first time in literally thousands of years, there were no Jews left in Hebron. So this began to set the stage for what was to come over the ensuing years. Today there are 49 or 50 Muslim countries in the world, and what we find interesting, 37 of those came into existence after Israel did in 1948. So there were only 12 of these countries that came into existence a little bit earlier than Israel or at the time of Israel. So sometimes we have the idea that the Middle East pre-existed this situation at the end of World War II, and it didn't. The modern Middle East came into shape after World War II, and the establishment of the State of Israel was one incident in that long process. Egypt came into existence first, or a partial independence at least, in 1922. The second country that came into existence at this point was Turkey in 1923. Again, Turkey has its own identified land. The third state to come into existence was Iran, again a Persian state that also had a clear identity with its own history and past. That was 1925. The new Arab states were mostly states that were created coming out of colonialism. So we have Iraq, 1932, Saudi Arabia, 1932, Syria, 1936, Jordan, 1946, 2 years before Israel, Libya, 1951, Morocco and Tunisia, 1956, Algeria, 1962. So you can see that during the 1950s and 60s, the other Arab countries were coming into existence across North Africa. The reason I'm making this point is to emphasize the Middle East was not a pre-existing political situation. It was a forming political situation during the late 1940s, 1950s, and into the 1960s. And the formation of Israel was in the middle of this process as these new Arab countries were trying to define their own nationalities and who they were and their definition as a country. And part of that happened as these new countries were defining themselves in relation to Israel. We sometimes look at the Israel-Palestinian conflict, the Jewish-Arab conflict there, as if it's an isolated, self-contained conflict. But here, one of the things I would like to call your attention to is that this is a part of the larger Middle Eastern situation. In the 1950s, with Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Arab nationalism that he was promoting, part of his definition was an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic definition. And he claimed all of the Middle East for the Muslim world, for Arabs. In Syria, so Egypt and Syria aligned in this axis. Jordan was a part of it. And they influenced these other new countries that were emerging all across North Africa, from Libya to Algeria to Tunisia to Morocco. They were coming to existence at the time of Nasser and at the time of Arab nationalism. So there was a movement, especially pushed by Nasser, which was to deny the existence of Israel, that all the Middle East had to be Arab. When the British were given the Palestine mandate to rule Palestine, Transjordan, that area around the Jordan River, they had already put into place a policy called the Balfour Declaration. And this was a declaration in 1917. Let me read it to you. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to divide Palestine, the Palestinian Mandate of the British, into a Jewish and an Arab sector. As the British Mandate was ending, we know that in May 1948, Israel declared its independence, and at the same time, the next day, the Arab-Israeli War started. And let's look a little bit at this issue of the 1948 war and the conflict that was going on between Jews and Arabs. When the first stage of this conflict between Jews and Arabs, that we might call the Civil War stage, began immediately after the vote of the United Nations to create the State of Israel. 2 states, one Israeli, one Jewish, one Arab. The beginning of the Civil War in November 1947 was not a surprise. Arabs had been broadcasting for months, for a long period of time, that if there would be a State of Israel, that they would fight against it. Knowing this, for years, the Jewish people in Palestine had been organizing self-defense units. And this, the Jewish Agency had an important role in helping provide central organization. There was a central directorate that was organizing all the Jewish affairs. And as a part of this, they organized the Haganah. Originally, the Haganah was a series of militia units, but it was organized under a central command. They had trained officers. Soldiers were recruited and trained. On the Palestinian side, there was no central authority controlling the militias. There were 800 villages and population groups, each one of which had its own local militia. So as the war began, the Civil War stage began in November 1947, Arabs outnumbered the Jews, and they thought because of that they would be able to defeat the Jews fairly quickly. But what happened, as the Civil War wore on, the fact of the command structure and of the organization of the Haganah meant that the Jews began winning the skirmishes with the local militias. So the Muslim families began withdrawing into the areas that were protected and more secure Muslim areas. The United Nations had divided the territory in such a way that the Jews were in control of the coastal areas, and the Palestinians were in control of the hill country, which was the better watered area, better for agriculture and so on. So in that division, there was an area that was clearly predominantly Muslim population. So the Muslim communities in the coastal areas began leaving their villages and going into the Muslim-controlled interior, what is now called the West Bank. Sometimes they went into Jordan, and there began the process of relocation. There were at the same time tens of thousands of Jewish settlers in what is called the West Bank, the mountainous region. They in turn left those regions and moved into the coastal areas where there was Jewish control. There were more Muslims leaving their villages along the coast than vice versa. And this led to something that in the Muslim community is called al-Nakba, the catastrophe, in which many Muslim villages were abandoned as people fled the war and the fear of the war and fled into safe Muslim areas. By the time we get to May 1948, the division between the Jewish-dominated coastal areas and the Muslim-dominated interior had begun to be fairly well established. It was known, the Arab countries, the Arab coalition, which included Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, with support from Iraq, these 5 countries had announced that they would invade Israel on the day that it declared independence. So that declaration came on May the 14th, and on May the 15th, the Muslim armies invaded. Now, the way they invaded is an interesting process here, because Egypt invaded from the south, where they were in control of the Sinai Peninsula and up through what is the Gaza Strip today. The Syrians were in the north. So the primary push came between the Egyptians in the south and the Syrians in the north. The Jordan forces on the east did something very interesting. Before the war broke out, Golda Meir, in the early days in 1948, had been negotiating with King Abdullah of Jordan. In fact, she made trips there. She disguised herself, dressed up in a jalaba, went to visit King Abdullah, and she was negotiating with him that Jordan not invade Israel. King Abdullah was important here because he was in command of the Arab Legion, which was the Jordanian forces, and he had also negotiated with the other heads of state that he would be the commander-in-chief of all the Arab forces for this invasion. So he was the key figure in this process. He would not agree, of course, to not invade, and her efforts were futile in that sense. But an interesting thing happened. When the invasion came, the Jordanian forces invaded the West Bank, the predominantly Muslim area, but they stopped at the border at the line where the territory of Israel began. They did not invade Israel. So the Haganah basically was fighting a true front war between Egypt in the south and Syria in the north. The Egyptian and Syrian armies, you would think, would have been the larger forces, and they were to start with. But they were both new countries with basically outdated military equipment. So the force was not as overwhelming as it might have seemed. Now, up until May, the Haganah had never been able to buy heavy weapons. They had rifles. But once Israel became an independent country and the British had left, they were able to start buying heavy weapons. So they started trying to get airplanes, artillery, other heavier weapons to fight with. So in the first month or so, the first couple of months, the Haganah was able to hold off the Egyptians and the Syrians, and eventually during the summer, heavier weapons began to come into Israel, and they were able to fight the two armies to a standstill. By December, it was clear that Israel had actually been able to push those two back slightly, and it was clear that the 5-army invasion had not worked to wipe out Israel. When the time came that Israel made the declaration of its statehood, there was no declaration on the Palestinian side of a state. The Jordanians occupied the West Bank, and it became a part of Jordan. So we have the enigma that a Palestinian state was not declared and became a part of Jordan. So one of the issues since then has been the Palestinians have never been able to make their own decisions in a way because they have been controlled so much by the Arab leaders around them. So the critical support for the forming of a Palestinian state along the lines that the United Nations had voted were not accepted. And as a result, there was no Palestinian state. In January, there was 1949, there was a treaty ceasefire, and that stopped the first stage of this conflict. One of the problems that comes in the 1948 war is the issue of refugees. I'd mentioned earlier that as the conflict was wearing on, even starting in the Civil War stage in early 1948, as the militias were fighting each other, it was quite often happening that Arab families were leaving their villages to go to safe areas to escape the war, to escape the conflict. And as they were doing that, they were abandoning their villages. Starting in 1948 and continuing on into the 1950s, we find the Arab response, especially Egypt, which led the way in expelling Jews. The same thing happened in Iraq. If people were not expelled, pressure was put on Jews to leave. Baghdad, up until the 1950s, was 1/3 Jewish. The Jewish population was heavily invested in the business sector in Baghdad. But with the pressure to leave, the Baghdadi Jews began migrating out. The same thing happened in Syria. Same thing happened across North Africa in the various countries. So in 1948, there were over 800,000, some say as high as 1 million Jews in the Arab lands across the Middle East. By the time we get to the 1960s and early 1970s, there are virtually no Jews left in the Arab Middle East. So there was a major refugee problem. Muslim villagers leaving the Jewish sector of Israel, and Arab nations pushing their Jewish inhabitants to leave. So there's a major refugee problem. An estimated 700 to 750,000 Palestinians left their villages, and an estimated 850,000 Jews from Arab lands left their homes. In this gigantic population switch, as each group moved to the territory controlled by their own people. The Israel-Palestinian problem has continued up to the present, as we know, and it has gone through various stages. The first stage was the Arab nations' military stage we've already looked at. The second cycle of the conflict came with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and this, of course, was under Yasser Arafat. So we get in the 1970s, and it becomes clear that the Arab nations are not going to force the forming of a Palestinian state. The PLO takes up the opposition to Israel. In the meantime, in the 1967 war, Israel had pushed back the Jordanians and had occupied everything west of the Jordan. So Israel at this time was in a much stronger position. The PLO was formed to fight against this new situation. They knew that they could not fight militarily against Israel. It was the stronger power. So they chose the route of domestic violence. After 1967, Israel was caught in the position of occupying Arab lands that the Arab countries did not want. Egypt did not want the Gaza Strip back. Jordan, at that point, had given up its claims to the West Bank. So we have a situation in which Israel suddenly is in control of territories that it had not originally occupied. These were now Arab territories, and there was no clear solution about what to do with them. In the 1990s, there were a series of attempts to negotiate a two-state solution, and Israel on various occasions made proposals to the Palestinian Authority. In each occasion, it was not sufficient that the Palestinian leadership was willing to accept. Each time their proposal was rejected. So from the 1990s into the 2000s, up until 2006-07, we have continuing proposals for two-state solutions, which were never accepted. After that time, during the early 2000s, there were a series of suicide bombings in Israel, the bombings of buses, the bombings of restaurants, and the civilians that were being killed indiscriminately. At that point, the new state, the new political attitude began to arise in Israel, emphasizing security. No further negotiations have occurred in the last 10 to 12 years. And the new situation with the government that's been primarily Benjamin Netanyahu has emphasized totally a policy of control and non-negotiation with the Palestinians. During this time period, in the last decade or so, we've also had an emergence into a new stage of the conflict. But now we have the emergence of what might be called the Islamic Jihad cycle. This was with the rise of Hamas in 2006-2007 in the Gaza Strip, and the conflict is no longer a secular conflict. The PLO is a secular organization, and for them it was a secular fight. With Hamas, we find it shifting into more of an Islamic fight. Just as the Arab identity in this conflict has become more fused with Islam, a parallel thing has been happening in Israel. The Israel Defense Forces are the strongest army in the region, and people know that the IDF will give basic security to people. And the Netanyahu government has repeatedly emphasized its role as a security government. But given this situation, there's something else that is disturbing in living in Israel, and that's the constant threat it was the threat before of bus bombings and bombings in restaurants, suicide bombers. That has been controlled now, but a new threat has emerged, which are the rockets coming out of Gaza. Hundreds of rockets can be fired on any given day, and it can even go into the thousands of rockets that can be fired into Israel. And if you can imagine living under these circumstances, you have to live constantly. You have 15 seconds from the time that the air raid siren goes off to be able to get into a shelter. Israel has developed a way of doing this, but with the hundreds and thousands of rockets that are falling on Israel in a continuous process, that creates a living environment that is difficult to sustain. So we have a situation in Israel where the insecurity of life is a major issue. As a result, security itself has become a kind of religion in Israel, and the constant need to protect yourself and be aware of the threats that are around. On the other hand, on the Palestinian side, the controls at the checkpoints, the controls that the IDF have over movements of people are a constant fear and a constant problem for people. The Palestinians cannot move freely because of the controls that are established to establish security for the Jewish population, and that becomes an irritant for the Palestinian side. So we're in a situation now in Israel where both sides are concerned about security, and both sides have to live under the threats of an ongoing situation of conflict. As we have moved into the 21st century now, there's been an interesting shift in the Middle East and in the policies and attitudes toward Israel. The conflict that has begun to dominate the Middle East is the Shiite-Sunni conflict. This has been driven primarily by the Ayatollahs in Iran. Iraq is a predominantly Shiite country, but it had been ruled in recent decades by Sunnis. Sunnis had controlled the Shiites and had avoided Iraq becoming associated with the Ayatollah policies in Iran. The United States invasion of Iraq and the overthrow of the Sunni government there set up the situation in which the new Iraq is now dominated by Shiite forces. A democracy was set up, they held elections, and the government is, of course, Shiite. So now Iraq is an ally with its Shiite neighbor, Iran. As that developed, Syria also has been in its own civil war. Syria is a country divided between Sunnis and Shiites, but the government is a Shiite government. Lebanon used to be a country with Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but after the Lebanese war, Jews and Christians have basically been driven out of Lebanon, and the Arab governments that control it now have aligned with the Shiite axis. Hezbollah is really a Shiite associated force. So the new axis, the Shiite axis that has developed in the recent decades, has been Iran, now Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon with Hezbollah. And that has become a new force in the Middle East. The challenge of the Shiites is to the Sunnis. Sunnis control the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. And the primary conflict is between Iran and Saudi Arabia now, as Iran being the head of the Shiite coalition, Saudi Arabia really the head of the Sunni coalition. So the countries, we had talked about this earlier, the Sunni countries are the countries that go along the southern part of that Shiite axis. So all the Arabian Peninsula countries, Egypt, and the North African countries over to Morocco. So now we have this divide in the Muslim world between the Shiite axis and the Sunni coalition. And that has become the primary standoff. Now, in the process, the Israeli-Palestinian issue has gotten caught up in this. Hamas and Hezbollah are Shiite-oriented. The PLO has tried to keep in a neutral position. But the Sunni countries are not interested in a Palestinian state now because of the expectation that it would become Shiite-dominated. And it would become a part of that Lebanon-Syrian coalition that's in the Shiite axis. So we have a situation today that the Israel-Palestinian issue is no longer a local issue between Arabs and Jews in Palestine and Israel. It is now an issue between Shiites and Sunnis. As we look across the Muslim world, the positions on Israel vary, and it's quite interesting. So the further you get away from the Arab Middle East, the less intense the feelings are about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The issue of anti-Semitism in the Arab world has become dramatic in these last few decades. We don't have measures of it before that, but just historically it doesn't seem to have been so dramatic. But in the Arab world today, among the people, the common people, the anti-Semitic sentiments run very high. The highest anti-Semitic attitudes really come in the West Bank and Gaza, where anti-Semitism runs as high as 93% among the people. But as we move out from that into other countries, Iraq has a very high 92%. But you get into other countries where the conflict is less intense. Jordan, the neighbor of Israel, the anti-Semitism goes down to 81%. And in the rest of the Arab world, you get into Saudi Arabia, anti-Semitism is only 74%. If you get beyond the Arab world, we find some interesting numbers on this. In Spain, Portugal, and Latin America, we still have very high anti-Semitic numbers running in the 40% range. Not like the Arab world, but still a very high percentage. We get into the more northern European countries, England, the United States, Canada, and we find that the anti-Semitism rates drop down to single digits, 7, 8, 9% anti-Semitism. And I would like to mention that there are places in the world where there is an active attempt to create contact between Muslims and Jews. And perhaps the best example of this is the country of Morocco. The king in Morocco is actively involved in protecting the Jewish community. And we find there's a movement of pluralism in Morocco in which they attempt to show that although it's a Muslim country, but they are very open and welcoming to Christians and Jews. There's one organization in Morocco that is called the Association Mimouna, which is worth noting. The Mimouna Association is involved with studying the Jewish heritage of Morocco and preserving it. It started with a group of young people in universities who were interested in the Jewish heritage. Some of them had grandmothers or grandparents who had converted to Islam, but they were Jewish originally. So there are some Jewish roots involved in this. Not all, but some. And they have actively followed a series of activities in which to collaborate with the Jewish community, giving talks, meeting with Jewish groups, and more recently advocating the introduction of Jewish history into the universities in Morocco. So we do have cases like this, and you perhaps had the chance to see the video of a Mimouna celebration at the end of Passover, where Jews and Muslims get together and celebrate this event. So we do have places in the Arab world where there is an attempt to build these bridges. Egypt is becoming more actively involved in recent years in this kind of thing. We see Egyptian television with a program about a Jewish family now in Egypt and presenting it in a normal kind of way, not a critical way. We find Egypt and Morocco both restoring the Jewish synagogues that have been abandoned in their countries. And so there are positive steps being taken to build bridges between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims. Creativity for Peace and other organizations work toward this. The Arava Institute in Israel actively involves 1/3 of its students is Jewish Israeli, 1/3 are Muslim, 1/3 are international students, in a constant attempt to build trust between Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims. So we have these things going on, and this is one of the things we can look forward to and hope that in the future we find more processes of trust between Jews and Arabs. Thank you for your interest, and I look forward to hearing your responses.